Welcome to the Jewish Drinking Show, where we explore drinking and Jewish wisdom, history, practices, and more in the pursuit of healthy, mindful, and yes, joy-filled approaches to drinking and Jewish life. Welcome everybody to the 94th episode of the Jewish Drinking Show. I'm your host, Rabbi Drew Kaplan, and I'm very excited to discuss early Aharonim on Purim drinking with third-time guest to the show, Rabbi David Fried.
Thank you for having me again.
Totally. All right, for those less familiar with Rabbi Fried here, he teaches Judaics at the upper school of the New England Jewish Academy. He is also an editor and frequent contributor at the Lehrhaus. He lives in West Hartford, Connecticut with his wife Molly and their two sons, Elchanan and Saadia, and we share the same rabbinic alma mater, YCT Rabbinical School. So welcome back, Rabbi Fried.
Happy to be here.
So Rabbi Fried here, the previous episode on which you joined the show, Episode 61 concerned medieval Jewish legal authorities on Purim drunkenness. So these rabbis, also known in Hebrew as Rishonim, sought to make sense of an interesting brief discussion in the Babylonian Talmud concerning drinking on Purim, about which listeners can also check out Episode 19 of the Jewish Drinking Show on this topic. Rabbi Fried, how do the rabbis who come after these medieval rabbinic authorities, how do they deal with this topic of Purim drinking?
Well, we're going to be looking at the early Aharonim, that's specifically the rabbis from the 16th and 17th century. We'll look at sort of how does this get codified in Shulchan Aruch and Ramah, which is sort of the starting point for the Aharonim, and then how some of the early commentaries on that deal with the issue. So to start out with Shulchan Aruch, it's very interesting. So for
those maybe less familiar, so what Rabbi Fried and I are going to be discussing this episode are basically Jewish normative rabbinic legal authorities in the 16th and 17th centuries and what they talked about this. Now, what Rabbi Fried just mentioned about Shulchan Aruch, which is literally translates to set table, but is widely regarded as sort of a helpful legal rabbinic handbook from the 16th century, right? Yeah, it's a pretty normative and standard. Not to say that it's necessarily the end all be all. People have their arguments on it.
Together with the Ashkenazi glosses of the Ramah of Moshe Isserles, it kind of forms the basis for I'd say 95% of psak in the post Shulchan Aruch world.
Right, for establishing normative rabbinic legal practice. Right. Yeah. And also, I should say, just for a sort of a chronological sense, this was in the 16th century that Rabbi Yosef Karo published it. So,
yeah.
Yes, and also I think it's helpful also to point out for especially listeners who may be less familiar with this work is that it's fairly terse. It's not really fully fleshed out, right?
Right. I mean, so to give, he has his two works, Shulchan Aruch and Beit Yosef, and the Beit Yosef he wrote first, and that's like his full analysis of everything. He quotes the Talmud, he quotes everything the Rishonim have to say on it. He gives you his analysis, he tells you who he agrees with, and then the Shulchan Aruch is just supposed to be his conclusions of all that analysis.
As a handbook, kind of a handbook, right? Okay. All right. So with that, I think that had that helpful literary context. All right.
Right. So here it's very interesting, especially with that context, that the Shulchan Aruch is basically supposed to be the conclusions from his analysis in the Beit Yosef, where here he actually does not follow his analysis in the Beit Yosef. So just to, we should give a little background, about the Gemara itself for people who maybe did not listen to episode 19, that we start with, this statement, one has to become intoxicated on Purim until one doesn't know the difference between the blessedness of Mordechai and the cursedness of Haman, and then that's immediately followed by this story of Rabbah and Rabbi Zera, and they had a Purim Suda together, and they got very drunk, and one of them says literally killed the other. Maybe that's a bit of hyperbole, engaged in some kind of violence towards the other. And then, the following year he invites him again and says, you know what, maybe not this time.
Miracles don't happen.
Miracles don't happen every time. All right.
Also, you mentioned that literally the statement comes first and the story comes second. Although it is important to note that chronologically, historically, the story came first. The statement came in the subsequent.
Right, and that the statement is from Rava, who's a fourth generation Amor, and the story is Rava and Rabbi Zera, who are third generation. Yes.
Right.
That's interesting.
And Rava is a student of Rava's. So the story happened. And then his student came along and articulated this thing that people have to do. An apodictic statement, if people want to get fancy.
Yeah. So the question is, the question that we discussed, that was the major point of discussion, when we spoke about this last time in the Rishonim was what is the role of this story in relation to the apodictic statement? And we saw the position of Rabbeinu Ephraim, who says, the role of the story is to say that we don't rule like the statement, is to undermine the authority of the statement and say, no, we don't actually rule this way. And the Beit Yosef, in his analysis,
it serves as a cautionary tale that does, that instead of necessarily illustrating as an exemplar of the statement, but it really says, maybe we shouldn't be doing this.
Right. And so the Beit Yosef, in his analysis, seemed to very strongly favor the opinion of Rabbeinu Ephraim, and seemed to, he quoted a number of other Rishonim who agreed with that, didn't really quote anyone who disagreed, seemed to be very strongly going in that direction. That is to say that we don't really hold by this idea of, if one has to get intoxicated to the point of not knowing the difference between Haman and Mordechai, and that the story undermines the legal authority of that statement. And yet, when you open up Shulchan Aruch, contrary to what seemed to be the conclusion of his analysis in Beit Yosef, he just quotes the statement from Rava. He doesn't. Now, we saw a whole bunch of interpretations what exactly that means. He doesn't tell us which interpretation he holds by, which leaves it open to some of the commentaries. But just the fact that he quotes it at all is surprising, given the direction his analysis seemed to be going in the Beit Yosef.
So I do want to mention, because Rabbi Karo writes about this in his Beit Yosef, which translates to Joseph's house. So in his Joseph house commentary, he mentions this, what Rabbeinu Ephraim had written, which super summary of it, which is that there are many, many things can happen that are really, 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 really severely bad that can come out of drunkenness, such as murder, major sexual transgressions, and so on. And so he ultimately just says, and at least this is what Rabbi Karo mentions of Rabbeinu Ephraim, is, you know what, just drink a little bit more than you're used to, and that counts. Yeah. But none of that complexity or nuance or whole discussion, as you just mentioned, gets into his Shulchan Aruch, his set table. It's just, right? It's really
he just quotes the Gemara straight.
He quotes Rava directly.
If he really held like Rabbeinu Ephraim, right, he would have said, okay, have a little to drink. You're right. Rabbeinu Ephraim does say you should have a little bit more than usual, but not Adol Yada, right? Rabbeinu Ephraim specifically says, don't do what Rava was advising. And in Shulchan Aruch, he does not rule like Rabbeinu Ephraim. He just quotes Rava. Right.
Direct quote from the Talmud. So and then we get an interesting comment or gloss from Rabbi Moshe Isserles, right? Who's roughly a contemporary, also roughly mid to late 16th century.
40 years younger, but in rabbinic terms, that's roughly contemporary.
It's an appendage. I mean, they were living at the same time, right? So as you write, Rabbi Isserles, who's living up in Poland, is younger, right?
Yes. Yeah, so he's right. So he's writing his Ashkenazi glosses on Shulchan Aruch, and he doesn't disagree. Mm-hmm. He doesn't disagree with what Shulchan Aruch says in terms of the fact that we do indeed rule like Rava, but he gives his own interpretation, or he rules like his own interpretation of what he thinks the Rambam is saying.
I just want to say he does frame it as saying there are some who say. So he's not necessarily saying don't do what Rabbi Karo wrote. He's not saying this is really the right way. He's like,
he's not right. He's not saying,
right.
The problem is we don't know what Rabbi Yosef Karo meant. Because yes, Rabbi Eliezer Karo endorsed Adalayada, but as we discussed last time, there are half a dozen interpretations of what Adalayada means. So the Ramah is giving his interpretation of what Adalayada means, and he's saying,
I do want to say he is saying V'yesh Omrim, that there are some who say. So he's not necessarily saying that he's on board with it.
Yes, he is saying it B'derech V'yesh Omrim, absolutely. My general presumption is that when the Ramah says V'yesh Omrim and doesn't quote any other Yesh Omrims, it's the one he agrees with.
It sounds, it's interesting. I mean, I'm not just, whatever. I don't know his style so well. I wonder if he's also trying to mean not so directly contradicting Rabbi Karo. He's just adding, like, there's this other way to do things.
Yeah, I mean, again, we're only discussing 16th and 17th century Aharonim tonight, but certainly the way the later commentaries take him, they all assume that this is the position he's ruling like.
Okay, fair enough.
He goes to say, again, he's not arguing with the idea of Adalayada, but what does it mean until you don't know? Mm-hmm. And he says, until you don't know means you should go to sleep after you. It doesn't mean get so drunk you don't know. It's not talking about intoxication. It means have a little bit to drink and then take a nap, go to sleep. And when you're asleep, you don't know exactly. You can't tell the difference between things in your sleep. So Adalayada means take a nap after you have a little bit to drink at your Purim Suda. And
although he does pick up Rabbeinu Ephraim's notion of drink a little bit more than you're used to, doesn't necessarily have to be that much, but just more than you're used to.
But Rabbeinu Ephraim doesn't say anything about going to sleep. That's the key. Rabbeinu Ephraim thinks Adalayada, do away with that. We don't have this idea of Adalayada. Just drink a little more than you're used to. The Ramah is trying to practically not have you drink any more than Rabbeinu Ephraim thinks you should drink, but still find a way to be Mekayim this idea of Adalayada by going to sleep.
Yeah. And that sort of picks, and a lot of people make this connection to what we had discussed in that episode of Maimonides, Rambam, but for Rambam, I do want to make sure that this is not, that people understand that what Rabbi Isserles is advocating is not exactly the same as what Maimonides was advocating. Because Maimonides said, yes, you drink, you get drunk, and then you sleep. But like here, he's saying drink a little bit more than normal, and then you can sleep and you won't.
I think the Ramah thinks he's giving an interpretation of the Rambam, but like you said, I don't think this is the simple read of the Rambam. The Rambam says, Adche yishtaker v'yeradim b'shichruto. Sounds like until you become intoxicated and pass out in your drunkenness.
Right. But you're right. It's close enough that people who might have read Rambam might think, well, this is just another expression of that, even though it's a lot lighter.
The idea that sleeping can be an expression of Adalayada is definitely taken from the Rambam, no question, right? But the Rambam encourages drunkenness that gets you to the point of sleeping, at least what seems to be the simple read of the Rambam, whereas the Ramah is just taking that idea of sleeping and isolating it from the drunkenness.
Well, also, it's actually interesting because he's doing that, exactly what you said, and he's appending on Rabbeinu Ephraim's notion of drink a little bit more than you're used to.
Yeah.
So it's clever what he's doing there. And then he also adds in another piece to it as well. He says that you can do a little bit more, you can do a little bit less. Like was
that in the Ramah? That's in the Ramah itself. Okay. Yeah, you're right.
So he's saying you don't have to be so specific. You don't have to be so exact. It's, you want to have a little bit more. You don't have to have a little bit. Like it's not so extreme. He's like, yeah, a little bit less or more, whatever. It's not. Although it's cute. He says, that there's a certain. It's not that you're just getting drunk or even just drinking a shot or two. It's you still have heavenly intentions, which is
right. And that that certainly gets picked up on a lot by. Maybe we'll have another episode to discuss, 18th and 19th century Aharonim, but that gets picked up by them a lot as well. That line that whatever you're doing, you got to make sure your kavanah is l'shem shemayim.
Yeah. So that's an interesting, I don't know, just a little thing he threw in there.
Guess what? Purim is just around the corner. You looking for Purim resources? I got them. Check out jewishdrinking.com/Purim. Purim for resources and more. And if there's anything you don't see you would like to see, hit me up at drew@jewishdring.com. I'd love to hear your suggestions.
And then also in the 16th century, we have Rabbi Mordechai Yoffe, who is actually fairly similar to what Rabbi Isserles is advocating.
I mean, yeah,
In the
so he's a
Lehrhaus.
student of the Ramah, so that's not surprising.
Yes, okay.
Um,
A little bit later, but yeah.
right, and actually, so I didn't realize you.
Oh, he's actually the same birth year.
Yeah, he's born the the same year. Apparently, I did not
He
realize
just
that.
lived an extra 40
He
years.
lived much longer, but he is. I mean, he was, I believe, primarily a student of the Ramah, even if they were the same age.
Uh-huh.
Uh,
Yeah. So that's in the for those
yeah,
taking
so
notes at home.
So right,
the
so
Lehrhaus.
he does say very similar to the Ramah, except whereas the Ramah mentioned only the one gay shomrim, the Levush Rav Mordechai Yoffe, he mentions both gay shomrims. He mentions there are some who say have just a little more. There are some who say that you should actually become intoxicated. But again, like you said, he also concludes with that.
So those are the sort of the significant 16th century opinions here. So just as we close out the 16th century, that we have sort of what, it's interesting because Rabbi Karo, even though what he writes in his Shulchan Aruch is a direct quote of Rava's in the Talmud of simply just get drunk and you don't know, he does have a lot more what he wrote in his Beit Yosef of, maybe, especially the Rabbeinu Fried notion of, maybe just a little bit more than you would normally drink, because drunkenness can cause a lot of problems and certainly sinful behavior. And Rabbi Moshe Isserles as well as Mordechai Yoffe are offering, well, you know what? Maybe drink a little bit more, touch more than you're used to, and sleep, right? As well as what this heavenly intention. The 16th century rabbis, they're looking back at certainly the Rishonim that we had discussed in episode 61, the medieval Jewish legal normative authorities. And the 17th century rabbis here are largely working off of, they're certainly knowledgeable of those Rishonim, those medieval ones, but they're largely working off of what was written in the 16th century, right?
So, I mean, the way you grouped it, you wanted to put the Bach as a 17th century rabbi. I mean, he's
on the cusp.
Transcends that border, 1561 to 1640.
Right.
And the Bach very much is, stylistically like the 16th century rabbis here. He's working off of the Rishonim as his primary text. It's really not until the ones after him that they're working off of Shulchan Aruch as their primary text. Okay,
fair enough. So you want to talk about Rabbi Sirkis and his Bach is the new house, Bayis Chadash. And he wrote a lot here. This is a little bit lengthy.
Yeah, it's a little lengthy. And to summarize what he says, basically, he's looking at all of the Rishonim, again, that we discussed last time, who all of the ones who rule like Rava, but try and tone down Rava, try and tone down what Adal Yada means. And, and they say, all these different things. And, again, see our last episodes for all the details, but something less than total and complete drunkenness is what Adal Yada means. And he goes on and he says, no, that it doesn't fit with the context. That's not what it means. Adal Yada means like it sounds like. He says, the phrase he uses, Karo l'shichruto shel lot.
Yep.
Right? Adal Yada means you are supposed to get almost as intoxicated as Lot was, because that's what it would take to really not know the difference between Aharonim and Baruch Mordechai.
Yep.
But then he goes and says, yeah, that's what Rava meant, but we don't rule like Rava. We rule like Rabbi Fried.
Right. So So he articulates what Rabbi Fried mentions. That's really not something that we should be doing.
Right, which is an interesting, it's always an interesting point. The more normative you think a text is, the more you want to moderate your interpretation of it. Since he doesn't think Rava is normative and he thinks we don't rule like Rava, he's free to let Rava be as extreme as possible. Whereas all of the opinions who think we rule like Rava are much more inclined to want to find a more modern interpretation of what Rava meant.
Oh, interesting. Can you say that again? I love that articulation.
That the more normative you think a text is, the more moderate you want your interpretation of it to be. Whereas if you think a text is non-normative, it can be as extreme as you want because we don't rule like it anyway.
That is okay. I like it a lot. I hadn't thought about it in that terms. Yeah.
Yeah, so since the Bach thinks we don't rule like Rava, he's free to say, "Oh yeah, Rava meant shichur toshel lot." Whereas anyone who thinks we do rule like Rava,
which I'm sorry for those who don't know Hebrew, the Lot's drunkenness, and for a little bit of a context, so that's a reference to chapter 19 in the book of Genesis, in which Lot's two daughters get him ridiculously drunk, and he has no idea what's flying. So that's helpful context.
Yeah, so it's specifically because he doesn't rule like Rava, he's free to say, "Oh yeah, Rava really meant you should get that crazily intoxicated. Oh, but we don't rule like him anyway." Whereas, no one else of his generation or of the Rishonim, anyone who thinks that Rava is normative, isn't actually going to tell people practically you should reach shichur toshel lot. So they have to, moderate and tone down what did Rava mean.
Right, and so it's interesting because in his lengthy writing, not only does he mention the Rabbeinu Ephraim stuff, but he also, he mentions what the Baal HaMor and the Ran wrote about the literary arrangements, so that the story basically makes the whole Rava statement problematic.
Right, but they're all basically, they expand a little, but they're all basically on the same side as Rabbeinu Ephraim.
Right, but then he writes, because but he doesn't necessarily understand that just because the story negates the saying of Rava doesn't mean it's nothing. It's worthless. There's no requirement. He just says, that, okay, so you drink more maybe than you would normally drink. It makes your heart happy. And that you could be like buzzed or even actually drunk, and even drunk where you can't even speak in front of a king, which is taking language from the Talmud as far as prayer requirements, that you have to actually be able to speak in front of a king. Rakshi dato alav, so that at least you have a certain. It's interesting because he's balancing here, right? He's like, you can drink more than normal. You want to be happy, buzz. Actually, you can even be drunk, where you have and more than just drunk, where you're not able to speak in front of a king, so you can't daven, but you can't pray, but not shichur toshel lot, not Lot's drunkenness. Like, you have a dat alav, you can still have a mindfulness about it, just don't lose yourself, right? And so that's like, it's an interesting middle ground. But then I do want to say that he does say, well, you know what? But at least, there's a mitzvah aspect, but it's not a sine qua non. It's not, it's not as if like, well, if you don't drink, you don't, you haven't fulfilled anything. It's more of like it's an opportunity. It's a mitzvah opportunity.
Yeah.
I find Rabbi Sirkis here like fascinating. Like, he finds this middle ground. He's like, don't go to this super extreme, do something, but if not, you don't really lose anything if you don't drink.
Right. I mean, you wind up with what he says you should do because we don't rule like Rava is not all that different from what some opinions say we should do, but it is like Rava.
So
the practical guidance is not all that different, even if their interpretation of the Talmud is different.
Right. I think ultimately for him, it knocks Rava's statement out of what does chayiv mean. It's not that you're really obligated, but it's more of a mitzvah opportunity. I think ultimately that's how he is able to make it in a practical fashion. That whether you want to drink a little bit, get really drunk, just not super drunk, and it's an opportunity. It's a mitzvah opportunity, but it's not an absolute requirement.
I hope you're enjoying this episode so far with Rabbi Fried. I wanted to break in since Purim's on its way. Might as well discuss another Purim topic. I want to give you a sneak peek into next week's episode featuring Rabbi Adam Rosenthal as we discuss 14th century Purim parodies. Here's a sneak peek.
It's worth noting that people did ban these works from the early 14th century, and also subsequent parodies.
Like rabbis were banning them?
Yes, yeah. During the Counter-Reformation, it seems like Jews got the idea of banning books and having their own index of sorts unofficially. They seem to lose their sense of humor, and they saw these works as works that were heretical, works written by heretics and people who just wanted to belittle the Talmud and belittle Jewish tradition. Little did they know what we know now, that they were written by good Jews, rabbis. And they were certainly read by good Jews.
I hope you enjoy that sneak peek with Rabbi Adam Rosenthal. Now back into this episode with Rabbi David Fried.
But then we get to his son-in-law.
Yes.
Yes, his son-in-law.
His son-in-law, the Taz. Yeah.
Yes. So his son-in-law, as you mentioned, the Taz, and for those less familiar, that's an acronym for Turei Zahav, golden pillars. This is Rabbi David Alevi Segal, born in 1586 and died in 1667. Actually, his father-in-law is only like a quarter century older. So it's his father-in-law is 1561 to 1640, and so Rabbi Segal here is 1586 to 1667.
Yeah,
so, and
people got married young in those days.
Yeah, so he's a commentator on the Shulchan Aruch directly.
Yes.
Yes.
Right. So he's a commentator on Shulchan Aruch. So he accepts Shulchan Aruch as normative here, that we rule like Rava. And yet he offers his own creative interpretation of the sugya, and that's
Yes.
very unique, among the Aharonim, that he's doing what a lot of the Rishonim did. We saw last time in, a lot, the Rishonim had all these different versions of what Adalai Yada means, and the Taz doesn't rule like any of them and offers his own unique interpretation of what Adalai Yada means, and he develops this idea that there were two big Chasdei Hashem in the Purim story, two great acts of kindness from God. One was the downfall of Haman, and which obviously entailed with it the rescue of the Jewish people. And two was, after all that, and Achashverosh promotes Mordechai and gives him Haman's house and makes him this great person throughout all of the Persian Empire. Ar Haman, that refers to God's kindness to us in foiling Haman's plan. And Baruch Mordechai, that refers to God's kindness in, allowing all the greatness that happened to Mordechai and the Jewish people afterwards. And what does Adalai Yada mean? Adalai Yada means you're at the point where you couldn't have, a theological discussion about which kindness from Hashem is greater.
So I want to add on so what he wrote is so strikingly different than everything else here that we have in our conversation, because the first half of it, he's not like directly talking practically, right? Because everybody else is trying to figure out they're trying to figure out the balance, how to manage this tension between Rava's statement in the Talmud and the story of Rabbah and Rebbe Zera. The first half, he doesn't bother with that at all. He's setting up this whole system about of trying to figure out Sheva, like how to praise, to be appreciative of what God has done for us. And he's that's the background, that's the push. And so then he says, once you have sort of that mechanic set up of the Shevach mechanic of appreciation, then he says, okay, you should drink. And then he's the way he works that out into with this force of, we should be so appreciative of God, and we got to get drunk. So like, how do they work together? Well, so he says, before you really actually get drunk, so you have to know, you have to give appreciation, and you have to really give it the simcha ad sheyavo lidei kach shelo yavchin. Oh, so you have to like give it at this like certain point, right? So you're already like not really knowing, but like not fully drunk. I don't know. It's an interest, right? How do you?
Yeah, I mean, we saw it sort of, again, it echoes a lot of the Rishonim we saw in that they try to equate Adalai Yada with an inability to do some particular thing, some particular skill.
Yeah.
And so we saw, and we'll see it echoed. We'll see some of these positions echoed in some of the Rishonim and some of the Aharonim that we're about to cover. Is it about you can't do math or you can't recite poetry? And but the Taz has his own unique idea that wasn't said in the Rishonim, that it's about, can you have these sophisticated theological discussions? And I don't know exactly like how does that compare to the other things, like in the process of drunkenness, at what point exactly do you reach the point where you can't have sophisticated theological discussions? I don't know.
But it's also in the process. Like you're having these conversations, you're giving appreciation to God
Exactly.
as you're drinking, and you're increasing both until you somehow are just drunk. Like it just carries you forward.
You're supposed to be, like you said, you're supposed to be having the theological conversation while you're drinking, and you've reached the point where you're Yosef, I guess, when you can't have that conversation anymore.
Right. And so it's like I don't want to say you're like ascending in both of them until you can only just ascend. I mean, it's very different. It's clever. It's original. I found it fascinating. I also like the way you framed it also as like this theological appreciation conversation, and you're also drunk as well. And it's also like the drunkenness is really serving as a helpful, I don't know, boost, a push to it. It's part and parcel of the acknowledgement and appreciation to God.
Right, and much more so than some of the other opinions, which are just kind of like, all right, well, we can technically call this skill not knowing, but like you said here, like this actually adds an important dimension to what's supposed to be going on at the Purim Suda while you're doing this drinking.
Yeah, that's pretty original, and it's very clever too. They don't always happen in tandem, so that
right.
Hey there, I wanted to see how you're enjoying the episode so far. If you have any feedback, comments, questions, anything, please let me know. And also, if you have topics as well as potential guests, including, who knows, maybe yourself, please let me know. Feel free to reach out to me at drew@jewishdrinking.com. Thank you, and now back into the show.
All right, coming down from that high, we get into something that we saw earlier in the medieval authorities, and this is not just one, but actually two. We have both Rabbi Abraham Gombiner, the author of Abraham Shield, Magen Abraham, who lived from 1635 to 1682, as well as a later authority, Rabbi Eliyahu Spira, 1616 through 1712, the author of the Great Elijah, Eliyahu Rabbah. So, what does he say? What do both of them advocate?
They are, also trying to, again, accepting the Shulchan Aruch as normative. We rule like Rava, but now just trying to define what does Adol Yada mean. And unlike the Taz, who had his own creative interpretation, they just go back to one of the opinions we saw in the Rishonim, namely the idea that Arur Haman and Baruch Mordechai are the same thing in Gematria. And Adol Yada is when you can't do the arithmetic in your head to be able to show that they're the same thing in Gematria.
So for those who may not have yet heard the previous episode, so what is the Gematria and what's this arithmetic aspect to it?
So Gematria, the numerical equivalences in Hebrew, Aleph is 1, Bet is 2, until you get to Yud is 10, Chaf is 20, etc. Mm-hmm. And if you take all the letters in Arur Haman and add them up, and then you take all the letters in Baruch Mordechai and add them up, turns out they add up to the same thing, which is awfully convenient.
Right. So Rabbis Gombiner and Spira here are both advocating, well, you can't really properly do the math here, or the numerical equivalence.
This is not original, as we said. This was one of the opinions that we saw in Rishonim, but they say this is the one we should consider normative, that Adol Yada is when you can't really do this math in your head anymore.
Right. And it's also helpful. They're both Rabbi Gombiner is like Rabbi Segal in that he's a commentary on the Shulchan Aruch. Rabbi Spira here he's a commentary on the Levush, right?
Yeah, he's actually a commentary on the Levush.
Right. So it's interesting that he's going in this
which means he was much neglected for many years because nobody studied Levush until the Mishnah Berurah brought him back. But
interesting. Okay. Learn something new every day. Good to know. All right, so they're advocates for lack of ability to do the numerical equivalency work. All right, we have one final one here for our conversation. I'll say his name, Rabbi Hezekiah de Silva, who lived 1659 to 1698. So also the author of New Fruit, Pri Chadash. So what did he advocate?
So he's my favorite one here.
Oh, really?
And actually, yeah, because I think in terms of his literary read of the Talmud, I think he has the strongest read.
Okay.
So I mentioned him in our in our episode on the Rishonim, although I forgot that was him. But I mentioned I read this interpretation somewhere. I don't remember where. So going through the Aharonim, it was
really a tease for this episode.
Yeah. So it's the Pri Chadash who mentions this, and he argues against Rabbeinu Ephraim's read of the sugya based on the structure of the sugya itself, where he says it can't be that the conclusion of the sugya is that we don't rule like Rava, because what did Rabbi Zera say to Rava? After the incident, when he invited him again the next year, he said, "No, thank you. A miracle doesn't happen every year." So Rabbi Chadash wants to say, if the conclusion is we don't rule like Rava, why didn't he say, "Okay, I'll come to you for Purim Suda, but no drinking this year"?
You're saying Rava could have said that to Rabbi Zera.
Sorry, I forget which way the direction goes in the sugya. Who says a miracle doesn't happen every year?
That's Rabbi Zera. He's the one who was
Rabbi Zera.
slayed.
So yes, instead of saying a miracle doesn't happen every year, he should have said, "Okay, I'll come to you for Purim Suda, but no drinking this year." From the fact that he doesn't give that answer, that there's
part and parcel
Rava that you can't have a Purim Suda without drinking.
Right, it's part and parcel of the celebration.
Yeah, and I think, and this is my favorite, because I think it really truly shows an understanding of how a Gadta works in the Talmud.
Oh, interesting. Okay, how so?
Because the Gemara, what Rabbeinu Ephraim is claiming, the Gemara doesn't do that. The Gemara doesn't use narratives to make legal points. Every now and then it does. But then the Stamma the Gemara will say it's doing that. You might see, you'll see a statement from the Gemara, and the Stamma will say, Velohi deha, and it'll quote a story, or Velet hilchatak patei deha, and it'll quote a story. But without the Gemara doing that, that's just not the function of narrative in the Talmud. The function of narrative in the Talmud is to put other values in tension and in conversation with the accepted law, but not to contradict the accepted law.
I like that. Introducing some nuance. Okay.
Yeah, and of course, the interesting thing is the Pri Chadash wraps it up with, he says, while I think Rabbeinu Ephraim's wrong in terms of how to interpret the sugya,
the literary, right?
Practically, we should all do today like Rabbeinu Ephraim, because you read that Hadorot. He says, and if Rabbah and Rabbi Zera weren't, needed to be worried about what would happen if they drank too much, certainly all of us today need to be worried about what would happen if we drank too much. And therefore, practically, because our generation is not as great as their generation, we shouldn't do like Rava, even though really the halacha follows Rava.
Right. There's been lots of sins, right? You mentioned there's a decreasing generations. I mean, he does say ultimately just drink slightly more than you would normally on a Yontif, on a holiday.
Right. He winds up he winds up practically advising people to do like Rabbeinu Ephraim's advice, even though he thinks Rabbeinu Ephraim has the wrong shot in the sugya.
Right. Well, it's funny because I did not expect that to be your favorite. This Pri Chadash, this last one, to be your favorite. Which, I mean, it's clever of refuting Rabbeinu Ephraim, which we saw, obviously Rishonim mentioning, and throughout this episode, his opinion keeps coming up. It's sort of a moderating, because of the literary read, a moderating effect practically. It's interesting that Rabbi de Silva here says, I disagree with his read, but I like practically what he's advocating.
Yeah. I
mean, for me, throughout this, it was helpful to go, I don't know about the listeners, but for me, it was helpful to go through these different opinions. And also, I mean, ultimately, I greatly appreciated Rabbi David Halevi Segal, the Taz. I really appreciated his originality. Obviously, he's very big into the drinking aspect, but he also imputes a lot of original meaning into what's the drinking got to do with it. Right.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of originality and, like you said, meaning making, yeah, I agree. Definitely the Taz wins the game on that one. in terms of close literary analysis, I like the Pri Chadash.
That's good.
Hey there, I hope you're enjoying this episode so far. I want to break in again, and if you have ideas beyond the show, beyond the podcast, beyond this video content, if you have ideas for what Jewish drinking can bring you, whether it's, who knows, maybe it's Zoom sessions, maybe it's events, maybe, who knows, swag, please let me know. I'm very curious to hear from you any ideas, things that we can do, things that I can bring you from Jewish drinking. So feel free to reach out to me at drew@jewishdrinking.com. I'm happy to bring that to you. All right, now back into the show.
So this was fantastic. Thank you so much, Rabbi Fried. This was, I don't know about anybody else. For me, it was insightful. It's also great to have this conversation. And of course, listeners, viewers out there, I hope you also greatly benefited from understanding these major rabbinic figures in the 16th and 17th centuries, as far as what they had to, their various laying out of normative rabbinic legal opinions when it comes to drinking and Purim. Hopefully, we'll have future such 18th and 19th century conversations. But for now,
next year.
yes. All right. Before we go, Rabbi Fried, is there anything that you want to promote?
Well, as an editor at the Lehrhaus, always happy to promote our website. If you like thoughtful writing on both scholarly and timely Jewish topics, check out thelehrhaus.com.
All right, wonderful. All right, well, thank you so much, Rabbi Fried, and L'chaim.
L'chaim.
L'chaim.